This is lesson 37. We're going to be covering USP and USP chapter 797. This will cover chapters 229 and 241 in your book. So I want to provide a few introductory remarks before we jump into chapter 5 in the book on USP chapters and compounding laws and rules. I am not an expert on USP and compounding issues. So I was very fortunate to have Patricia Keenley, who is an expert on USP, to write this chapter for me. So the good news is you've got the expert on this particular topic who wrote this chapter. I am not going to be able to go through all the details of this chapter because it's beyond my understanding, some of it, but I'm going to try and hit the highlights of it that I think might be items that might appear on the MPJE. The good news is I find that most pharmacists that I talk to and most pharmacy students that I talk to have a pretty good knowledge of USP, particularly USP 797, because most pharmacy students come out of school and they've been certified on sterile products and they're pretty familiar with USP 797. But I'm going to talk about how it works from a legal standpoint and some additional requirements that are very specific to Florida as we go forward. So I think Patty does a really good job in this introductory section, starting on page 229, talking about legal recognition. The thing to understand here is USP is a standard setting organization, and then states can choose to adopt USP and put it into their regulations. They may just adopt it by reference. Some states have the ability to adopt things by reference. Some states do not have the authority to do that, so they have to rewrite the entire USP chapters into their compounding regulations. If a state has not adopted a USP chapter, it is possible that those chapters could be enforceable if they are numbered under 1,000. So the ones we're going to talk about, USP 797, USP 795, USP 800, are technically enforceable. They would be enforceable by the FDA, but the FDA is really not in the business of checking to see if someone's in compliance with USP. It really falls down to the states. So I wouldn't worry so much about that. We're going to focus on those chapters that have been adopted by Florida specifically and some of the differences in Florida as we go through this. USP has, you're most familiar probably with USP chapters that we're going to talk about, 795, 797, and 800. But USP also provides general notices, which are more basic information on the use of their standards. Then USP chapters are a little bit more detailed, pretty detailed when we get to things like USP 797. And then USP monographs are very, very specific about specific formulations or compounds. And the USP compendium contains almost 200 different compounding monographs. So if you're involved in compounding, you may be familiar with these monographs. We're not going to be covering the monographs here today, but really just the USP chapters. And as it says on the bottom, like I said already, the USP does not enforce these standards. It's accomplished by the states. Perhaps by accrediting organizations, like in hospitals, the Joint Commission may enforce these standards as well. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act does enforce some of the standards through the use of bulk substances, which must meet the USP requirements. And as I said, those chapters that are under 1,000 could technically be enforced, but they're not going to be enforced unless the state has adopted those particular chapters. So we're going to be focusing, there's 4 general chapters that, USP chapters that impact compounding. These are listed on page 230. USP 795, which is for non-sterile preparations. And you'll see in the note there on the book that Florida has not adopted USP 795. They have rules on compounding, even compounding rules related to non-sterile products, but they have not adopted USP 795. So I'm not going to cover USP 795 in this review course. It's also not covered in the book. USP 797 is for sterile compounding. Florida has adopted that, and we'll be discussing that in the rest of this lesson. USP 800 is for hazardous drugs, compounding of hazardous drugs. Now, Florida has not adopted USP 800, but there are several references to hazardous drugs in the MPJE competencies. And in fact, in the previous version of the MPJE competencies, they talk specifically about USP 800. Now, I would hope that Florida wouldn't ask a question about USP 800 since they have not adopted it, but I cannot guarantee that because it was so specifically mentioned in the competency statement. So I am going to include a brief review of USP 800, which is in the book, in the next lesson as well. There's also USP Chapter 825 on radiopharmaceuticals, which we will not be covering. It has not been adopted by Florida as well. So you see on page 231 when we jump to USP 797 that Florida has adopted the 2008 version of USP 797 with some modifications. There's been updates to USP 797 that have been in the works for several years now. They were initially proposed in 2019 and they were delayed. Then they were published again. There were some appeals and some concerns that the pharmacy world had. So they were taken back and revised, and they were then republished in September 1st of 2021. Those were never finalized because those were appealed. And then finally, right when we were trying to finish up this version of the book, in late 2022, on November 1st, USP did publish a revised Chapter 797. This chapter will not be enforceable until at the earliest 12 months from that date of publication, which would be November 1st, 2023. So it's not currently in effect. So the current version in effect in Florida is still the 2008 version. Now I will tell you that the Florida Board of Pharmacy has a compounding committee, and they're going to be looking at not just USP 797, but also USP 795 and USP 800 over the next year, during the year 2023. So a lot of this could be changing, but I'm confident that it's not going to change at the earliest until November 1st, 2023, and it'll probably take even longer for Florida to either adopt some of these new changes. So you don't need to worry so much about these new changes that just came out in November of 2022. I do have at the end of this chapter a document for you that kind of gives you the highlights of what is changing, just so you'll have that. I was not able to get that into the book because the book was already going to print when those new chapters came out, those new in November of 2022. I do have them in my federal book, but I was not able to get them into the Florida book. But again, that will not be on the MPJE because they are not yet in effect. So one of the things I think you need to know for sure are the different categories of compounded sterile products. We abbreviate that CSP in the book, compounded sterile products. And the old version of USP 797, which is still one in effect in Florida, categorizes CSPs into 4 categories. There's immediate use products, low-risk products, medium-risk products, and high-risk products. I think you need to know these definitions that are listed on page 232. And to help you out, we've included some in the study tip on page 232, some kind of examples of what would be considered low risk, medium risk, and high risk. I think the thing to remember about the high risk product is always anytime you're taking something from a non-sterile, you're starting with a non-sterile active pharmaceutical ingredient and making it sterile, that's going to be considered high risk compounding. And a lot of the requirements as you go through here are going to depend on how the product is categorized. Other things that will depend on this categorization will also include beyond use dates, which is another area I think you need to focus in as well. So make sure you know these definitions and maybe some examples of them, because a lot of questions could be asked based on these different categories. Now, ironically, these categories are going away under the new rule, but for now you still need to know these particular categories. So obviously training the personnel who are going to be performing sterile compounding is a big part of USP 797. So if you look on page 233, here's a summary of what their training requirements are. You start with initial training, which goes over some theoretical principles, but there's also practical skills, including the aseptic work practices. There has to be written competencies involved. information on hand hygiene and garbing and those types of things. And then we actually do tests to make sure people are actually following these sterile techniques. And these include media fill tests and gloved fingertip tests. One thing you probably need to know when you requalify people for training, you must repeat some of these tests. In fact, the media fill test and the requalifying glove fingertips must be done at least every 6 months if personnel are compounding high-risk products, and at least every 12 months if they're compounding low or medium-risk products. The study tip on page 233 explains when you do the media fill test at what levels you have to take action based on if something is growing out of the test. So I'll let you read that section. Again, I'm not sure how detailed they're going to get on the MPJE, but that gives you an idea of when you have to take action based on your media fill tests. Okay, in the bottom of 233, there's some information about the facilities requirement. Obviously, how a facility is set up as far as an IV room is very important when we're compounding sterile products. So the sterile compounding area has to be have a cleanable surfaces and a temperature of under 20 degrees Celsius. If you turn over to page 234, it gets into the primary engineering controls. These are basically the IV hoods where the products are actually going to be compounded. Your traditional PECs, or primary engineering controls, are your laminar airflow workbenches and also biological safety cabinets. Those are good examples that are commonly used to prepare the compounded products. But there's also compounding aseptic isolators, CAIs, and compounding aseptic contaminant isolators are additional types of primary engineering controls. These PECs, or primary engineering controls, must maintain an ISO 5 environment, and the study tip explains what an ISO 5 environment is. Remember, the lower the ISO number, I guess the more sterile you can say it is. The other thing to remember about these IV hoods and these PECs are they must be certified by an outside agency every 6 months. So you also have secondary engineering controls, and before we had 797, we just called this the IV room or the IV lab, which is the room where you place the IV hood or the PEC. So you have SECs and PECs. There are two types of secondary engineering controls. You can have a clean room suite, which has a positive pressure anti-room and at least one buffer room. And you can see the ISO standards for those are listed for you in 3C on page 234. However, if you don't have a clean room suite, you could have a segregated compounding area, or SCA, which is not as I guess I'm trying to say not really preferred. It's preferred to have a clean room, but sometimes depending on the physical characteristics of the building you're in, you may not be able to have an actual clean room. So you can have secondary engineering controls that are a segregated or separated compounding area. On the top of page 235 and also on this particular slide is a summary of the minimum ISO classifications for the various rooms that we just talked about. As you can see, the anti-room needs to be a minimum of ISO 8 if it opens only into a positive pressure buffer room. If the anti-room opens into one or more negative pressure rooms, it has to be ISO 7. So these are the kinds of things I would expect to see on the MPJE, things like ISO classes, categories of the different types of compounded sterile products, beyond use dates, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. Okay, turning over to page 236, there's a section on hand hygiene, garb, and personal protective equipment, or PPE. This is something I think you need to read through. Also, notice here in number 3, there is a specific order in which you're supposed to don or garb your input and perform certain functions here, going down in order A through F. the order that you're supposed to prepare to do sterile products. I never thought about it before, but that would make a great question of those types of questions where you have to put things in a certain order. But that's a good example of the type of information that could utilize that type of information on the MPJE. Okay, I'm not going to go through all the additional requirements here, but you can see on page 236 you must have standard operating procedures. You can read through that. Obviously, the compounding technique becomes very important when we're talking about sterile products. And then there's a section about the components you use in compounding on page 237. I will point out on the component section on page 237, make sure you note that number 4 there, that active pharmaceutical ingredients that you use, if they are not USP or National Formulary grade, must be accompanied by a lot-specific certificate of analysis from whoever you bought the products from. So that becomes very, very important. When it comes to the compounding process on page 237, letter I, notice for the high-risk products, the high-risk products require terminal sterilization. This is generally accomplished through an autoclaving process. Because remember, with high-risk products, we're talking about non-sterile products, and they have to be sterilized at the end. So that's something different for high-risk products that you should remember. Also, on the top of page 238, if the high-risk products that you're compounding are made in groups of more than 25 units, in addition to being autoclaved, they also must pass a bacterial endotoxin or pyrogen test as well. And then the chart on the top of page 238 tells you that any of the components you're using for sterile compounding do have a limited amount of time that they can be used. So that's the kind of thing I think you need to memorize as well, whether it's an ampule, single dose vial, or multiple dose vial, and whether or not it's been maintained in an ISO 5 environment or taken outside of an ISO 5 environment. You can see that on the chart on page 238. So the beyond use states that you can apply to compounded sterile products. There's a chart of this on the slide here, as well as on page 238. This is definitely something that you want to memorize for purposes of the MPJE, because several questions could be asked about this. It's just a very typical common base knowledge of USP 797 that they expect you to have. So this is a chart that you definitely want to memorize and make sure you understand very, very well. Another chart that I think is worth putting to memory is the pressure gradient chart, which I have on the slide here, and that's also available on page 240. Again, something that can show up on the MPJE that they expect all pharmacists to know. So just a couple of other additional requirements in USP 795. We talked about certification already. Remember, you have to certify your primary engineering controls, your IV hoods, every 6 months. You also need to have certified your IV rooms, your secondary engineering controls, every 6 months, or if you make some type of change to the room that could affect the airflow, so keep that in mind as well. The facilities where the compounding is taking place also have to be monitored. You see under viable monitoring on page 240 to ensure that microbial, both bacterial and fungal contaminants are not present. This is accomplished with air sampling and surface sampling, and an explanation on how that is done can be found on page 241, as well as the action levels when you have to take action based on that monitoring of the facilities. And of course, you have to have a quality control program and a policy for your entire sterile compounding process, and you see that in letter M on page 241. So again, that's just a quick overview of USP 797. Obviously, it's much more detailed and complex than I was able to go over, but I think the book gives you a pretty good summary of what you need to know for purposes of the MPJE. But if you're less familiar with sterile compounding, you definitely might want to reach out and look for other resources that go into a little bit more detail, or make sure you read this section of the book in a lot more detail in preparation for the MPJE. This concludes lesson 37. We'll pick up again with lesson 38 on USP 800, hazardous drugs.